What's up, everybody? Thank you so much for joining me on this latest edition of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. As I said to you guys, just coming off the show, the will of Khabib versus the skill of Conor McGregor, that I would put out another pre-recorded episode of the podcast that everybody would enjoy, that would pertain to Khabib versus Conor. Well, here it is. There's a storyline out there that I can really shed some light on for the MMA fans, because it concerns a fighter that, it's no secret, this is the reason why I really fell in love with this sport. This fighter is the reason why I grew to show a real admiration for the sport, for the fighters, and ultimately, when I turned 19, I decided that I wanted to get into sports writing and get into sports journalism and get into communications and find something along those lines to where I could have my sports writing career and my podcast. And the reason why that was the first time I ever saw George St. Pierre fight. That's when I realized that mixed martial arts was a sport. And I want to make it clear as to why I thought that at the time, or maybe even considered that it wasn't a sport. Not to discredit any of the other fighters of years past, but to look at the differences in George St. Pierre. I always refer to George St. Pierre with friends, with family that know I'm a massive fan of his, is the first real athlete in MMA. The first guy that really brought athleticism to mixed martial arts. You could have a striker versus a wrestler. You could have a jiu-jitsu guy versus a Greco-Roman guy. You could have a judo guy versus a Muay Thai guy. But George St. Pierre was the first guy that you actually saw, not a wrestler, not a striker, not a jiu-jitsu guy, not a Muay Thai striker, but a mixed martial artist, someone that could do everything and in between. And I've said this hundreds of times throughout my MMA fanhood, but in my opinion, George St. Pierre is the greatest of all time. I don't think there's a close second to him. He did things clean. He did things the right way. He's a professional. He was the company torch guy. He brought the UFC to another level. And when he left, the UFC needed to find another star. Enter Conor McGregor. So I think, obviously Brock Lesnar has his own star power, and that's why he's coming back to fight Daniel Cormier. But I think the true, authentic MMA superstars that we have seen, not counting Ronda Rousey, being that she's not in it anymore, but the true two superstars that we have seen that are active are George St. Pierre and Conor McGregor. Those are the two big pay-per-view stars that this company has had over the last literally 25 years. And there's a story out there now that it's not really a story, it's legitimate. George St. Pierre himself conducted a press conference in Australia and talked about how he would like to take on the winner of Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor. Now, this is not news to me. This is not new information. This is not something that shocked me once it was officially said by George St. Pierre, because I want to take a trip down memory lane for a moment and offer you guys something that most people don't even know. Dating back to UFC 196, Conor McGregor was slated to fight Rafael dos Anjos. Dos Anjos broke his foot. Conor could not fight Dos Anjos, obviously, because Dos Anjos couldn't fight. So Conor decided to accept a fight with Nate Diaz. And the other fighter that was on the bill quite possibly to take that spot, was actually Uriah Faber. Those are the two guys that the UFC offered to Conor, but the weight was too much of a weight difference for Uriah. Moving up to 155, they didn't want to do that. Uriah did, but the UFC didn't. And Nate Diaz was a fresh, new fight. Gave Nate Diaz a chance to get the exposure that he deserved after calling out Conor in his last win versus Michael Johnson. I offer you this because after that fight was slated to take place, if Conor McGregor had won that fight, lo and behold, the man in the front row was the longtime welterweight kingpin George St. Pierre, who was going to enter the octagon to do a square-off with Conor McGregor. The UFC had it planned. They had that planned. Had Conor won that fight, they were going to reward him for taking that fight on short notice versus a bigger man by fighting the biggest draw outside of himself, outside of Brock Lesnar, and outside of Ronda Rousey in George St. Pierre. That was going to be his reward. Instead, that didn't happen. We all know what happened after that. Nate Diaz submitted Conor. We had the rematch. The rematch was one of the best fights in UFC history. And then we had the Eddie Alvarez champ quest completed. We had the Floyd Mayweather fight, and now here we are. You know, Khabib wins the title that was stripped from Conor earlier in the year, and now Khabib is fighting Conor. Conor is fighting Khabib. Meanwhile, George St. Pierre had talked about coming back for a long time up until he did. There was about 2 years of real staunch negotiations where the UFC was really selling George St. Pierre short, and they were finally able to make that happen, and they made that happen on November 4th of 2017, where GSP comes back and fights Bisping for the middleweight championship to join that list that McGregor made so prominent and being a champ. You know, GSP wasn't holding two belts at once, but had reigned over the welterweights for over half a decade and fought in a weight class that he had never fought in before. Whereas Conor could honestly say he was a lightweight in the cage, king of the cage. He was a lightweight in Cage Warriors. He was a career lightweight who started his UFC career in featherweight with a quest to win a featherweight and lightweight title, and he did. So, if you don't catch my drift, both of these fighters, Conor McGregor and George St. Pierre, have probably had the two most storied careers of all time. I offer you the fact that George St. Pierre was supposed to be the eventual welterweight champion. Matt Hughes was getting older. George St. Pierre was young. He was knocking guys out. He was finishing guys in every which way you could think of. The first fight he loses to Matt Hughes. Second fight, fights Matt Hughes, wins. And I can't remember the chronological order, but George St. Pierre, yes, okay, I was right. Yeah, he loses to Matt Hughes, then he beats Matt Hughes. Then, if I'm not mistaken, I can't remember because it was so long ago. Then he fights Matt Serra in his first title defense after beating Matt Hughes in the second fight for the welterweight title. And Matt Serra was given literally no shot by the Vegas odds makers. And Matt Serra knocked out George St. Pierre in the first round. That loss created one of the greatest careers, in my opinion, the greatest career in UFC history. And in very similar fashion, the loss to Nate Diaz created a very unique superstar crossover career for Conor McGregor. Although their fighting styles are so different, Conor and George, their careers are very much one and the same. So to ask ourselves, does GSP deserve a shot at Conor McGregor if Conor McGregor wins? 100%. To ask ourselves if George St. Pierre deserves a shot at Khabib Nurmagomedov, who's undefeated? 100%. Because the UFC is desperate for pay-per-view buys. It's one of the main reasons they were trying to lure George St. Pierre back. Actually, George St. Pierre was trying to lure the UFC into allowing him to come back. For a little while, it didn't look like the UFC was going to do that. Lo and behold, they obviously did, and the UFC made money, George made money, and he rode off into the sunset. The only issue with giving George St. Pierre a title shot, which is the only way he'll come back, is that he will probably relinquish the title. But the fans, the diehard fans of MMA, do not care. Because it's almost as if each and every time George St. Pierre decides to come back, he's just reminding us how great he was. He's just reminding us that he is, in fact, the best MMA fighter of all time. And there's a lot of Conor McGregor fans out there, millions of Conor McGregor fans out there that have thrown this out there to me, that have said that Conor is the greatest of all time. Well, I disagree with that, but the only way to prove that, let's prove it. This is a fight sport where we put two dudes in a cage and see who's better. Let's prove that. If Conor McGregor gets through Khabib Nurmagomedov, why not make that fight? Dana White would be a moron to not make that fight, because that is 100% unequivocally the biggest MMA fight ever. Talking about Khabib versus Conor, to date, that one's signed. To date, that one is the biggest MMA fight of all time. But if you really want to look beyond that, to add to Conor McGregor's superstar, that's the fight that would have to be made. Let's just say Conor starches Khabib, finishes him in the first or second round. The intrigue for a fight after that with George St. Pierre would be unlike anything we've ever seen. And people would fall victim to it. The winner of Poirier versus Diaz would fall victim to it. If Poirier wins, I think there's a realistic shot that Conor versus GSP does happen at 155. Then again, if Conor wins. But if Diaz beats Poirier, finishes him, we will see that trilogy fight between Conor and Diaz. If Conor wins and if Nate wins, that will be for the UFC lightweight strap. That's what's going to take place. And all this stuff about Nate Diaz not fighting, guys, this is a publicity stunt. This is a headline grab. That's all that is on Nate's part. He's not serious about retiring. He's not serious about not fighting Poirier, and neither is Poirier serious about not fighting Nate. It's all part of the narrative heading into that fight, heading into even Khabib versus Conor. It's just a part of the game. Don't get too bent out of shape over it. I see a lot of Diaz fans on Twitter. They're worried that Nate's not coming back. Nate's coming back. The contract was signed, and that's that. We could see something take place in which, let's just say we're in October. Let's just say Conor dusts Khabib off, exits the cage unscathed. I know the UFC is going to Toronto. I know that's happening in December. That could be the venue. Conor wanted to fight Khabib in Russia, apparently, from Dana White. Would Conor want to fight GSP in Canada? Would Conor want to fight GSP in Toronto? Conor's already been a massive success in Toronto. I was there at the World Tour. I was there. I was in the crowd, right there. The gentleman walked right by me, and I heard the jubilation and joy in the stands. I mean, it was like a rock concert. So, just throwing that out there. Very interesting discussion subject matter right here. Does GSP deserve a shot against the winner of Khabib versus Conor? 100%. Does he deserve to skip the line? 100%. Why? Because he's George St. Pierre. That's why. No other reason but that. People say, "Oh, the politics in this sport." They didn't care about the politics in the sport when